Hello, so today I'm going to be talking about the kind of reflection that I have on the course Educating Exceptional Students. I'm going to talk about the way that we differentiate instruction to each of the specific concepts we talked about in this class. One of the most important things that I have learned from the College of Education at Fort Hays is that in order to see students succeed, we need to make the program fit the student, not the student fit the program. In other words, that means that as teachers, we need to not pigeonhole a student into a specific program to see them succeed, but rather fix the program to that specific student so that there's no doubt they will succeed. So first I'm going to start talking about the multicultural aspects and the diverse families that could possibly be in the classroom. There's a high percentage of poverty among the United States, and it's likely that within our classroom we're going to experience students that are living within poverty or aren't getting the correct nutrition they need or something of that nature. And because of those things, those students will be a little bit different, and they will tend to act differently than those of a household which can afford to put food on the table. We really just need to make sure that we help those students know where their resources are and opening up our hearts to them, because we know that their life is going to be a little bit different than ours. For that of students of a different culture, it's important to understand that their language may be different, and specifically their customs and the way they treat people and greet people will be very different from ours. I know that there are specific cultures around the world that eye contact is actually not supposed to happen whatsoever, so it's something that we need to focus on as future teachers, making sure that we know the background of each child. And another thing that I've learned that's so important from my education here at Fort Hays is that you need to create a relationship with students so that you do know who they are and what their background is in order to best teach to them. In terms of learning disabilities, some of the things that we've talked about for differentiating our instruction for students is social stories. We did a pretty large example of this in class. We talked about all the different visual aids we can use to help students get through just like daily tasks they wouldn't necessarily be able to get through with a learning disability. A good example of that would be in a calm down space or calm down area in a classroom, having the different emotions they feel so that they can kind of point at them and debrief from that emotion they're feeling by accepting that they feel that emotion. Another thing that was important with learning disabilities was making sure that we're able to determine those learning disabilities. So as educators, we need to educate ourselves on what the signs of those disabilities look like so that we, to the best of our ability, are able to recognize signs in children that could potentially put them on the spectrum of a learning disability, because like I've put here, the earlier the diagnosis, the more help the child's going to get, and it's going to be much easier to help them if we find this learning disability in first or second grade versus high school, because the services that will be readily available to them will be much more helpful from a younger age, so they start to develop habits and start to realize what kind of student they are themselves, and so that the IEP can be built up and each teacher who receives them the next year as a future student is able to adapt their curriculum to that student specifically. Next, we have attention deficit hyperactive activity disorder, so ADHD. There are 3 different types, and we need to do our best as educators to recognize those types, because there's going to be the type that is always on interested in organizing their things or flipping pencils, or just way too interested in one topic instead of the topic that's at hand. Or there's going to be the students who move a lot and can't sit still and can't focus at all. So it's important to recognize those signs in the students that we have in our classrooms and being able to teach to that specific type. So for example, you could potentially have students take brain breaks more often, or having those specific students take brain breaks. It's also important to have them stand or sit or maybe take a break. Another important thing I learned was making sure that the length of time for a test or quiz is actually longer for these students, because they're going to have a lot harder of a time staying on task and trying to accomplish the test. And that's all different types of instruction, some of which may have to involve creating a classroom environment that is very active. So if you know that you have a student in your classroom who has attention deficient hyperactivity disorder, you might have to try to make sure your students are up and moving a lot. So having a lot of kinesthetic activities that student can get hands-on with and stay focused on a specific task instead of sitting and listening to lecture or watching videos or something of that nature. Next, we have intellectual disabilities and autism. Something I learned from this class that I have kind of carried with me my whole life is the use of the R word and how just truly detrimental that can be to a person. It's used as an insult and never should be. And as a future teacher, it will be one of my classroom rules to make sure our language is appropriate, and within that, the R word being completely banned from my classroom will be a large part of that. We also talked about the spectrum of autism in the classroom and how some students are going to be nonverbal and will not have the kind of brain function necessary to keep up with their curriculum in your classroom, but there also could be, on the different side of the spectrum, students who are extremely brilliant and have a very high IQ, but have a very hard time staying on task because they're beyond the learning that is happening in your classroom, and they'll become bored and tend to act out in different ways that distract the other students in your classroom. Next, we talked about traumatic brain injury and hearing loss. It's important with traumatic brain injuries. What I've learned is that students are just not going to be exactly who they were before. Anything traumatic is going to have that happen to a student, but specifically a traumatic brain injury will completely detriment what that student used to be for you. So when that student walks in the classroom again, you have to pretty much relearn that student and figure out how you're going to differentiate instruction to help them achieve the goals of your classroom. Within that, you'll have to change instruction to them. You may have to use more visuals, you may have to use more audio. It all depends on some tests that you can take to determine where that student is at intellectually, and make sure their cognitive abilities are still there before you start to throw them back into instruction and curriculum. It's important with hearing loss to recognize the use of your oral communication. Because these students may not be able to hear, it's important to recognize how much you're using oral communication. So instead, you can maybe utilize different methods of communication in terms of maybe a whiteboard for that student to communicate, or for you to communicate to that student. It's important to have the class aware of the student's disability as well, so that they don't poke fun at the disability, or specifically so that if they're working in a group project or something, they can, within that group project, help that student succeed in ways that maybe they can't, because this person has a disability and they have become very strong in one suit and the other students have not. So it's important to just communicate with your classroom what you expect of them, because you want nothing but the best for that student. Lastly, we talked about visual impairments and gifted children. We talked about utilizing different forms of communication with visual impairments, just like with hearing loss. It's important with the visually impaired people with visual impairments to differentiate the way that we communicate with those people, because they might not be able to watch videos, or because they might not be able to watch things be acted out or science experiments to be conducted. It's important that we find a way to let them listen for those things. It's also important to have a classroom that's safe, so that they can get from one place to another without a whole bunch of obstacles in the way. With gifted students, it's important to understand that each student is going to be very different. I've noticed that a lot when I was in elementary school and with myself as well, and making sure that you differ the instruction for that student so that they don't become bored in your classroom. Overall, this semester was amazing, and I'm so thankful for this class because learning to differentiate our instruction to each individual student is very important to me, and I'm so thankful that this class opened my eyes to all that students have to offer for us.